Good evening, this is Brass Tacks. I'm Zaka Jacob. Prime Minister Modi will be speaking at the Summit of the Future on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. The aim of the Summit of the Future is to address the two most pressing concerns that the world is contending with right now. And that is the two ongoing wars, the one in Russia and Ukraine, which has been going on for the better part of 2.5 years now, and the war in Gaza, which is closing up on a year between Israel and Hamas. And just when you thought there was a ceasefire agreement that is going to be clinched in that war, now a second front and a much more active front seems to have been opened by Israel on its northern border with Lebanon, attacking Hezbollah. Even as we speak, the Lebanese Health Ministry has confirmed more than 250 people have died in what is the largest airstrikes by Israel since the end of the 2006 Lebanon-Israel war. Now, the question is, the world can ill afford. Forget about one, it certainly cannot afford two wars happening at the same time. There is a knock-on effect, and the worst hit are the developing countries, India included. So the world needs to find ways to not just stop these two wars, but also how to find ways to insulate future generations from the ravages of conflict. This is on the back of a highly successful Quad summit that happened over the weekend in Wilmington, Delaware, the hometown of US President Joe Biden. A host of agreements were signed in the 6th Quad summit, including a significant one on joint exercises by the Coast Guards of all four Quad countries. It's called the Quad at Sea Observer Missions. It will start as early as 2025. This is a clear and present message to China that it cannot go about coercively trying to impose its own will and trying to change maritime boundaries or affect the freedom of movement and navigation in the Indo-Pacific. The question is, will the world rise up and deal with these multifold challenges, whether it is putting an end to these two wars in Russia, Ukraine, as well as in Israel and Gaza, or will it flounder? The Prime Minister speaking at the Summit of the Future.
Excellencies,
विश्व के सबसे बड़े लोकतंत्र
on behalf
भारत
of
की ओर से
India, the world's largest democracy,
और 140 करोड़
and
भारतवासियों की ओर से
1.4 billion Indians,
आप सभी को नमस्कार।
greetings to all of you.
जून में अभी
In the
मानव इतिहास के
largest
सबसे बड़े चुनावों
election in
में
human history held
भारत के लोगों ने
recently in June,
मुझे
the
लगातार
people of India
तीसरी बार
have
सेवा
given
का
me the
अवसर दिया है
opportunity to serve them for the third
और
consecutive
आज
term. And
मैं सिक्स ऑफ ह्यूमैनिटी की आवाज आप तक पहुंचाने यहाँ आया हूं। फ्रेंड्स, जब हम ग्लोबल फ्यूचर की बात कर रहे हैं तो ह्यूमन सेंट्रिक अप्रोच सर्वप्रथम होनी चाहिए। सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट को प्राथमिकता देते हुए हमें मानव कल्याण, फूड, हेल्थ सिक्योरिटी यह भी सुनिश्चित करनी होगी। भारत में 250 मिलियन लोगों को गरीबी से बाहर निकालकर हमने यह दिखाया है कि सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट कैन बी सक्सेसफुल। सक्सेस का हमारा यह अनुभव हम ग्लोबल साउथ के साथ साझा करने के लिए तैयार है। फ्रेंड्स, सक्सेस ऑफ ह्यूमैनिटी लाइज इन आवर कलेक्टिव स्ट्रेंथ, नॉट इन द बैटलफील्ड। और वैश्विक शांति एवं विकास के लिए ग्लोबल संस्थाओं में रिफॉर्म्स आवश्यक है। रिफॉर्म इज द की टू रिलेवेंस। अफ्रीकन यूनियन को नई दिल्ली समिट में G20 की स्थायी सदस्यता इसी दिशा में एक महत्वपूर्ण कदम था। वैश्विक शांति और सुरक्षा के लिए एक तरफ आतंकवाद जैसा बड़ा खतरा है तो दूसरी तरफ साइबर, मैरीटाइम स्पेस जैसे अनेक संघर्ष के नए नए मैदान भी बन रहे हैं। इन सभी विषयों पर मैं जोर देकर कहूंगा कि ग्लोबल एक्शन मस्ट मैच ग्लोबल एम्बिशन। फ्रेंड्स, टेक्नोलॉजी के सेफ और रिस्पॉन्सिबल यूज के लिए बैलेंस रेगुलेशन की आवश्यकता है। हमें ऐसी ग्लोबल डिजिटल गवर्नेंस चाहिए जिसमें राष्ट्रीय संप्रभुता और अखंडता अक्षुण्ण रहे। डिजिटल पब्लिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर should be a bridge, not a barrier. ग्लोबल गुड के लिए भारत अपना डिजिटल पब्लिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर पूरे विश्व से साझा करने के लिए तैयार है। फ्रेंड्स, भारत के लिए वन अर्थ, वन फैमिली, वन फ्यूचर एक कमिटमेंट है। यही कमिटमेंट हमारे वन अर्थ, वन हेल्थ और वन सन, वन वर्ल्ड, वन ग्रिड जैसे इनिशिएटिव्स में भी दिखाई देता है। पूरी मानवता के हितों की रक्षा और वैश्विक समृद्धि के लिए भारत मनसा वाचा कर्मणा से काम करता रहेगा। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
So the Prime Minister there addressing the Summit of the Future at the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly, a very brief speech where he talked about how food security, health security and sustainable development are going to be critical going forward in the 21st century. He's reiterated a line that he had said earlier in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where he said the solution is not in the battlefield. And he also chided from the UN General Assembly hall, chided world countries to realize that reform is the key to relevance. Of course, India has been asking for a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. Aman Sharma, National Affairs Editor, is at the UNGA. He's tracking the developments as well as the Prime Minister's speech. Aman, so a very brief speech by the Prime Minister. He touched upon food security, sustainable development, health security, and also, most importantly, reiterated a line that he's used before, that solution to the world's problems cannot be found in the battlefield. Please elaborate.
Yes, absolutely, Zaka. I think 3 to 4 major takeaways from this short but very important speech. The Prime Minister clearly saying that our success lies in our collective strength, not on the battlefield. And, you know, this is the version of the statement which he's made earlier, that this is not the era of war. A solution will not be found amidst blasts and bullets. It has to be found on the talking table. So I think the Prime Minister, since he's landed in America, we have seen him repeatedly say in his opening remarks at the Quad Summit and now at the UNGA Summit of the Future that there is a need for global peace. Territorial integrity and sovereignty needs to be respected. All the nations need to work around that. He's also mentioned territorial integrity and sovereignty in his speech at the UNGA just now. So clearly the Prime Minister is saying that, look, we have to find these solutions on the talking table. We can't find them on the battlefield. Another important pitch by India when it comes to the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, or even Israel and Palestine, because the Prime Minister also met the Palestinian president last evening in a bilateral meeting, where he said that, you know, he asked for he said India desires a ceasefire and India stands with Palestine when it comes to the horrific loss of lives which are being seen in Palestine as a result of the war. Another important statement I think the Prime Minister has made about is the need for reforms in global institutions. He has said that look at the G20 platform. African Union was included in the G20 as a step in that direction to reform global institutions, and that is a clear message that India needs a place on the table when it comes to the UN Security Council. The Prime Minister making a clear case that if global institutions are not reformed, they are not in sync with the present times, and India has been making that case very strongly. Even the US after the meeting between US President Joe Biden and the Indian Prime Minister in Delaware 2 days back. Even the White House statement had said that US backs India on this particular cause, that India should get a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. I think another important statement, Zaka, is on the global digital infrastructure. He has said the global digital governance model. He said India is ready to share its success in the digital public infrastructure mechanisms with the world, the UPI, the other mechanisms that India has started. He said global digital governance is needed. A digital public infra should not be a barrier, it should be a bridge. I think these are the 3 to 4 major takeaways from Mr. Modi's speech.
All right, Aman, keep an eye out for the rest of the Prime Minister's program today there in New York. It's his third and last day there in his 3-day visit to the United States. Started off, of course, in Delaware with the Quad Summit. So that's what I want to focus on now. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to introduce our panelists. Rahul Chabra, former diplomat with the Ministry of External Affairs. Constantino Xavier is a senior fellow with the Center for Social and Economic Progress. Raymond Vickery is a senior associate Wadhwani chair in US-India policy at CSIS. And Seema Sirohi, senior author and journalist, is also joining us. Let me start with you, Mr. Chabra. So we had the Quad Summit, and I just want to run some of the top 2 or 3 outcomes, significant outcomes of the Quad Summit that happened over the weekend. The big one is the Maritime Security Initiative, the launch of the Quad at Sea, the Observer mission, which is set for 2025, cooperation between the Coast Guards of the 4 Quad countries, semiconductor supply chains, the establishment of a semiconductor supply chain contingency network, and also the United States will help establish a semiconductor fab unit in India for national security, and of course the Quad Cancer Moonshot Initiative. The underlying message, as has been the case from the first Quad Summit to the 6th one that concluded in Delaware, is that China cannot be allowed a free run, that China has to play by the rules of the established global order. It has to play by the rules of a free, fair and open Indo-Pacific. Do you reckon that the initiatives announced at the 6th Quad Summit in Delaware underline that fundamental message and that fundamental reasoning as to why these 4 countries came together in the first place?
Good evening, Zakat. Yes, thank you so much for having me on your show. You very well summarized the most critical aspects of that summit and the outcomes of the summit. And I think the message has gone out, may not be loud and clear, but the underlying message, it's been, the people who need to hear it have understood where we are headed. It seems to be the direction has been set. It doesn't have to be really hard in that sense, but the clear underlying message is there for people to understand.
Let me ask Constantino Xavier, but what relevance, or there is a view that some of these issues vis-a-vis China, the South China and East China Seas have been sort of forced to be pushed to the back burner because the most pressing concerns right now that the world is facing are the 2 wars. Just as we were all looking to a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas conflict, it seems like Israel has now opened another front with Hezbollah. There is the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, which is now going to go into its 3rd year in the next few months. You think the fundamental long-term threat emanating from China has somehow been relegated to the back burner because of this?
No, I think it'll take more than a few other crises to divert the attention from China, both in the US and frankly in India too, where people in the West often question India's own interests or reliability in terms of how it's looking at China. So yes, there's a lot going on. Like you point out, the Ukraine war has preoccupied NATO, the Europeans. The war in Gaza has again preoccupied a lot of resources and worrying a lot of the countries in that region. But frankly, in the long term, if you look at both the Quad and the bilateral statement over the last 2 days, between the lines, it's very clear. Both the US and India see alike a concern in China. They worry about China. They may sometimes disagree on the best way to deal with China. For example, the US is much more comfortable these days in talking about climate, the climate transition to Chinese. India has zero communication with China on any issue of relevance. But certainly, I think the larger arch of convergence is there. Both countries worry about China, and they also want to find a place for China in order that makes this order sustainable and peaceful.
Seema Surohi, Constantino is of the view that if you read between the lines, read the lines of either the Quad statement or even the bilateral statement when the Prime Minister met with US President Joe Biden, he says India and US are on the same page. But just hours before Prime Minister landed there, this whole meeting with Sikh groups and sort of an underlying commitment being given by White House officials that their concerns will be taken up, that has left a sour note. So much so that the National Security Advisor, ostensibly, we're given to understand he stayed back here in India because of the Jammu and Kashmir elections and the security paradigm involved there. But everyone knows that there was this summons issued by a court there in the United States just a few days before the Prime Minister was to land there, making it in a way not possible for one of his top officials to be part of the delegation. That is this whole Khalistan issue sort of sticking out as a sore thumb?
See, the one thing we have to clarify and distinguish is that the people who met officials at the White House, they're not Khalistanis as we know them. They are Sikh activists from the Legal Defense Fund and local California-based people, because these were the people who became the voice of the Sikh community after the 9/11 attacks. Remember, the first victim of the post 9/11 violence against Muslims was a Sikh gentleman. So these are activists. The other thing that's happening is this is part of domestic election politics. Democratic Congress people from those regions are under pressure from the Sikh community to speak up for the community with the administration. Because the Republicans are in play, some seats are in danger for the Democrats. All that is going on. On the other issue, but I do agree the timing could have been much better, because for India not to look at it otherwise would be very difficult. That, this has something to do with the alleged assassination plot, which it does actually, because these people who met White House officials were given to understand that they will always be protected by the government of the United States. On the other issue about the summons, the man behind this case, Gurpatwant Singh Panun, he has become like, law unto himself. He knows how to play the game extremely well. He will say things that are just short of violating free speech laws and exploits the situation completely. He filed the case with the idea because the Prime Minister was coming. He knows that. All that is public knowledge. We are told officially that the National Security Advisor did not come because he had other travels coming up very shortly. And, he has sort of headed the ISET, the Initiative on Critical Technologies, from which all of this has flown, on the bilateral front.
Okay.
So but I know that people in India will think, and people here as well, that he didn't come because of the summons.
Okay, let me ask Raymond Vickery. I want to move on to the future, which is that all of this will become less relevant in the next 2 or 3 months, depending on who is going to be the next occupant of the White House, whether it's Kamala Harris or whether it's Donald Trump. And there again, India has certain concerns. If it's a Harris presidency, the fear is all of these issues pertaining to religious freedoms, freedom of minorities, all of these will get further exacerbated. There'll be more attention on those issues, and that's a concern for India. If it's a Trump presidency, we know what his pet peeve has been, whether it's tariffs, whether it's the Harley-Davidson business, and now he's saying a uniform tariff across for all goods that come into the United States, which will be horrible for a developing country like India. So either Republican or Democrat continuance in the White House, there are concerns that India, and genuine concerns that India has.
Well, thanks very much for having me. There's no question that in a relationship between two great democracies, that there are always going to be these kinds of issues. But this should not obscure what has occurred over here in the last 2 days with the visit of Prime Minister Modi, namely with the Quad, a stepping forward by the Prime Minister and by India, not just in terms of the Indo-Pacific, but across the board in world leadership. As you rightly said in your lead-in to this session, the world can't stand 2 wars going on, and it certainly can't stand 3 wars, another one with China at the same time. So the question is, how do we build peace and prosperity? In the past, India has taken a position that Europe's problems are not the world's problems and has been standoffish. And there's been a sea change, it seems to me, if you read closely the joint declaration of the Quad. And if you look at the speech which was just given today by Prime Minister Modi at the UN, and that is that India is prepared to step forward and play a role across the world as a partner in trying to build peace and prosperity. This is the major news. The major news is not Khalistan and what is happening there. It's not even purchases of oil from Russia and keeping them afloat by Indian oil purchases. It is that India is now assuming what I and others have long advocated, and that is a major and cooperative leadership role as the largest nation on earth and largest democracy.
Rahul Chabra, we've been hearing this for a number of weeks now, that India would not be averse to putting forth some kind of a proposal to put a pause in the Russia-Ukraine war. After all, the Prime Minister was both in Moscow and in Kiev in a matter of a few weeks. Perhaps one of the few world leaders who could have managed to do that in the matter of 4 or 6 weeks. I believe that he has apprised President Biden of his conversations both in Kiev and in Moscow. But we haven't seen the contours of any such proposal. And even if there were one, how realistic is it that both of these countries would agree to a pause in the hostilities?
Yes, you're right that it's not necessary that there is a concrete proposal in that sense on the table, which you can just cross the T's and dot the I's and get it done. This is a conversation. It's going on at many levels with many different interlocutors. So India is one of the big sort of countries involved in it. There are other countries involved in it, and the decisions are going to be taken with, after an amalgam and an analysis of every country's viewpoint being taken on board. So as of now, it is difficult to say that there's actually a proposal and how are we going to go about this one, point 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's nothing like this. This is conveying sort of the sense, the feeling that Prime Minister Modi got. And as you said, he's the only one of the few leaders who's been able to meet both sides and be able to convey each other's the views of these sides, and then to the world at large, including the President Biden at the Quad Summit, to the other important leaders, what is the sense and the feeling that he's getting, which is very important for the others who have never even not met the leaders firsthand, face to face, to be able to get that sense and appreciation and be able to convey that.
Constantino, there's also the concern of what is happening in the neighborhood. While India, of course, is wanting to play a larger role, a bigger role, it's worried about what's happening in the Indo-Pacific. It wants to be an active player in shaping the new Indo-Pacific, and rightfully so. The Quad does have a role in that. But what about the near neighborhood? Look at what's happened in Sri Lanka over the weekend. Today, there's a Marxist president in that country. Look at what's happened in Bangladesh. There was the overthrow of a popularly elected prime minister. And now we are having to host her, and the new government there doesn't seem to have much love lost for India. Again, the Prime Minister met with the Prime Minister of Nepal just yesterday on the sidelines of the UNGA. Again, we've known the history between Mr. Oli and some of his anti-India pronouncements. And of course, Pakistan, I'm not even going there. Is there a concern that while India, on the one hand, wants to play this bigger role, wants a seat at the high table, the near neighborhood is a worry?
I don't think so. I don't buy the sort of either the globe or the region. I think India can walk on 2 feet. It's working in the neighborhood. It is working with other powers in the neighborhood, Japan and the US, unlike in the past. These are countries India is comfortable today to work with. In Sri Lanka, even in Bangladesh, I guess there will be a growing convergence between the US and India in the long term. So while you, I think, lay out the challenges, Zaka, that are obvious in the region, these are not new challenges. I mean, you spoke about a Marxist president elected in Sri Lanka. I remember a gun-wielding Maoist in Nepal that was being followed and chased around by Indian intelligence 20 years ago and became the Prime Minister of Nepal. And has become a major partner of Prime Minister Modi now. So politics will, of course, have ups and downs in the neighborhood. This is a challenging time because there's more than the type of people that are ruling in these countries. It is the volatility. Nepal has had 10 prime ministers in 10 years. In Sri Lanka, we've seen a succession of different presidents and different coalition governments. In Bangladesh, we're seeing more than a political crisis, a large economic crisis playing out in the country. And therefore, India will have to deal with that. But what's different from the past is that India today is working with the other countries to deal with this. You have the US, for example, Development Finance Corporation, putting in $550 million into Sri Lanka, into building up a port terminal there for an Indian company to benefit from, for India's economic interest and Indian export interest to benefit from. Again, you had the US, we're talking about the US today, you have the US putting $500 million into electricity grid connectivity between Nepal and India. Hydropower potential of Nepal that laid stagnant for decades, finally being explored to the benefit of India's consumers and Nepal's exports. So I think across the region, we're seeing India working with the region, through the region, with other partners. I could be speaking of Japan, of the Europeans, of the French, by the way. President Macron, for example, visited Sri Lanka recently. And including Russia, for example. India is also comfortable to work with Russia today to develop Bangladesh nuclear power. So yes, the region is difficult, but it's always been difficult. And actually, I see a lot of positive trend lines across the neighborhood.
Seema Sirohi, the other concern from India's point of view is that ever since President Biden met with President Xi Jinping some months ago in California, there is some kind of informal understanding between the Chinese and the Americans that, look, let's not stir the pot too much. Yes, we're not going to be best of friends, but we're going to keep this sort of simmering because we've got other concerns to take care of. And the view here in India is that means America is taking its eye off the ball when it comes to its long-term and most fundamental threat, which is the rise of China. Has the Quad summit gone to some extent to correct that perception?
Absolutely. I mean, look at the record. President Biden raised the Quad to the leaders level. That's the first action he took after becoming president. They've met 6 times. 4 times in person, twice virtually. Number 3, the export controls they've instituted from Washington that are hurting China. Top-end semiconductor chips can no longer be sold. They're trying to convince the Dutch and the Japanese and the South Koreans to sort of align their policies on all of that. So I would say they have kind of proved that they can walk and chew gum at the same time. There are 2 wars going on. They haven't taken their eye off the Indo-Pacific. The Quad statement, the Wilmington Declaration, as they called it, has got 2 major new initiatives, plus all the others, to show that they can deliver. And the maritime area, the domain awareness where they're sort of sharpening the tools, is very important for convincing other partners in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, that look, democracies mean good for you and there's no danger to your sovereignty. We are helping you to look at your waters more, clearly, and to see what illegal stuff is going on. Of course, the finger is pointing at who, because the dragon is always in the room whenever, Quad meets, even though all the 4 countries like to say, oh, it's not about China, it's not against someone, but it is for something, which is, both things can be true. So yes, I would say the Biden administration has actually, in my humble opinion, exceeded expectations
Okay.
on what they have done vis-a-vis China.
I want to give the final word to Raymond Vickery. Perhaps as a consequence of the two wars, perhaps unwittingly, what we're also seeing is a coming together and perhaps a hardening of the alliance or certainly the partnerships between Russia, China, Iran. You can maybe add some countries in the Arab world there as well. And this is in response to America and its own friends and partners and their response, whether it is in Ukraine, whether it is the Israel-Hamas conflict. You're essentially, for want of a better phrase, going back to the days of two blocks and the Cold War.
Well, I think there's no question that there is a danger of going back to the Cold War. On the other hand, look at what happened in the Cold War. Basically, it dissipated because people hung together and stood up for democracy and stood up for the rule of law in international relations. And the Soviet Union dissolved. The idea that somehow the standing together of U.S. And India vis-a-vis China is pushing China and Russia closer together, I think is really a pipe dream. The fact is that they've had an unlimited partnership for some time. These issues are difficult, but the real news here is that India is stepping up to be a player in regard to bringing peace and prosperity throughout the world. That's good news for everybody. It's good news in the United States. It's good news in India and around the world. And it seems to me that that's the basic message to come out of the Quad and the visit of Prime Minister Modi to the U.S. This week.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. We'll see how this story plays out. It is, as Constantino said, a tumultuous time in the neighborhood, but it's not a time that India has not been familiar with in the past. Yes, it is wanting a place at the global high table. It is now showing the world it is ready to play a greater role, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. India has very real stakes in the Indo-Pacific, and it was heartening to see the initiatives that have been announced, particularly the Quad at Sea initiative, which is going to be sort of a joint operations between the coast guards of the four countries. Will send out, if you're in Manila today and watching this, or if you're in Seoul and watching this, or if you're in Jakarta and watching this, definitely this sends out a positive signal to these countries. Now,